It was the dawn of a new era in warfare, an era of total war waged not just on the ground, but in the skies above. In the early days of World War II, the Luftwaffe, Nazi Germany's air force, seemed invincible. Their blitzkrieg tactics had swept across Europe, and their fighters and bombers dominated the air. The German High Command, confident in their aerial superiority, dismissed the nascent American air power with a sneer. They saw the lumbering, heavily armed U.S. bombers as little more than glorified flying fortresses, too slow and too clunky to be a real threat. The U.S. Army Air Forces, meanwhile, were struggling. Their bombers were effective in theory, but the reality of high-altitude precision bombing was proving elusive. Without a way to accurately hit their targets from thousands of feet in the air, their missions were often little more than a gamble, a desperate roll of the dice in the face of immense danger. The Germans believed they had nothing to fear from these clumsy American giants. But deep within the heart of the American military-industrial complex, a secret weapon was being perfected. A device so revolutionary, so precise, that it would change the very nature of aerial warfare and turn the tide of the war. They called it the Norden bomb sight, and it was about to make the German High Command's smug confidence vanish in a flash of fire and steel. The year is 1940. Across the Channel, the Battle of Britain rages, a desperate struggle for aerial supremacy. German bombers, the Heinkel He 111s and Dornier Do 17s, thunder through the skies, raining destruction upon London and other British cities. Their accuracy, however, is a crude, brutal thing. They bomb in formations, carpet bombing entire areas in the hope of hitting a target. It's an effective but wasteful method, a bludgeon where a scalpel is needed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States is still officially neutral, but its military is preparing for the inevitable. The U.S. Army Air Corps, soon to be the U.S. Army Air Forces, is in its infancy. Their bombers, the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, are the pride of their fleet. But there's a problem, a massive mission-critical problem they can't hit what they're aiming at. Precision bombing, the very doctrine on which American air power is being built, is a pipe dream. A bomber pilot, Sergeant Major Frank "Red" Gallagher, fresh from flight school, is filled with the kind of boundless optimism only a young man on the cusp of a great war can possess. He believes in the B-17. He believes in the doctrine. He believes they can hit a target the size of a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet. It's the kind of phrase that's passed around the mess halls like a mantra, a bold promise of what's to come. But Red's first training runs are a sobering experience. The bombs, released from thousands of feet up, drift wildly off target, swayed by winds, air density, and the sheer unpredictability of an object in free fall. The rudimentary bomb sights they're using are little more than a set of crosshairs and a mechanical timer. They're a guess, not a guarantee. The instructors, grizzled veterans of early aviation, shake their heads. "It ain't gonna work, son," one of them tells Red. "We can fly all day, but unless we get something to put the bombs on the target, we're just flying targets ourselves." The morale sags. The promise of the B-17 feels like a hollow one. The German High Command, receiving intelligence reports from their spies in America, laughs. Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, scoffs at the idea of American precision bombing. "They fly to their deaths in their fat airplanes and they will hit nothing," he famously says in a staff meeting. "Their attempts at pinprick attacks are a joke. They are nothing but cannon fodder for my fighters." He's not entirely wrong. Early tests show a disheartening level of inaccuracy. A B-17 raid on a hypothetical industrial plant in the American desert ends with bombs scattered across miles of scrubland. The dream of precision is fading fast. Meanwhile, in a clandestine workshop, away from the prying eyes of the press and the skepticism of the High Command, a man named Carl Norden is toiling away. Norden, a brilliant Dutch-American engineer, is a meticulous, almost fanatical perfectionist. He's been working on his bomb sight for years, long before the war. It's not just a machine to him. It's an extension of his own moral philosophy. He's a devout Christian Scientist, and he believes his bomb sight will be so accurate, so perfect, that it will end the need for indiscriminate bombing. He sees it as a tool for peace, a way to win a war with minimal collateral damage. The irony of this is not lost on his colleagues, but Norden's obsession is what drives the project forward. The Norden bomb sight, or the Stabilized Automatic Bomb Sight, is a complex, gyro-stabilized analog computer. It's a marvel of engineering, a tangle of gears, gyroscopes, and intricate optics. It takes into account the bomber's altitude, airspeed, wind direction, and air pressure to calculate the precise moment to release the bombs. It's not just a sight, it's a predictor. Norden is fiercely protective of his creation, treating it with a reverence bordering on religious devotion. He demands absolute secrecy. Every technician, every engineer, every pilot who so much as lays a hand on it must swear an oath of secrecy. They must promise to destroy the bomb sight rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The penalty for breach of this oath is treason. The American military sees the potential. They pour millions into the project, believing that this one device could be the key to victory. But Norden's work is slow, painstaking. He's a perfectionist to a fault, always tweaking, always improving. He refuses to mass-produce the sight until he is absolutely certain it is flawless. This drives the brass crazy. They need it now. The war is on the horizon. The pilots need it. Red Gallagher, still in training, hears whispers. Rumors of a new bomb sight, a super-secret weapon. They call it the Blue Ox, a nod to the legendary Paul Bunyan's ox. The secrecy surrounding it is almost mythical. A pilot from another squadron, a quiet man named Lieutenant Miller, tells Red a story. They say it's so secret they have armed guards on the assembly lines. They say the guys who train on it have to sign their lives away. They say if you drop your bombs with it, they land in the same spot every time. They say it's so good we won't even need fighter escorts. Red scoffs. Sounds like a fairy tale, Miller. We're in a real war, not a bedtime story. But the rumors persist. The idea of such a device, a silver bullet that could solve all their problems, is too powerful to ignore. Red's squadron is chosen for a secret demonstration. They are told to report to a remote airfield in the New Mexico desert. The atmosphere is tense. No one knows what to expect. They are led into a hangar where a single B-17 sits on the tarmac. A man in a dark suit, a civilian, is there to greet them. "Gentlemen," he says, "what you are about to see is the most important piece of equipment in the U.S. arsenal. Its name is the Norden bomb sight. You are to forget that name the moment you leave this room. From this moment on, you are to refer to it as the Blue Ox. You are to never speak of its capabilities. You are to never speak of its existence. You are to never, under any circumstances, allow it to fall into enemy hands. If your plane is going down, you will destroy this device. Do you understand?" The pilots, their faces grim, nod in unison. They are shown a small, intricate machine, a gleaming brass and aluminum box with gyroscopes that hum with a low electric whine. They are told to practice with it. The first few runs are no different from the training they've already had. The bombs go wide, but then a grizzled instructor, a man who has flown with Norden himself, takes the controls. "You're trying to fly the plane," he says to the pilots. "You're not. The bomb sight is flying the plane. You're just along for the ride." He demonstrates the process. The Norden sight is not just a predictor. It's an autopilot. The bombardier, using the sight, can actually take control of the bomber's flight path in the final moments of the bomb run, directing it with a precision that a human pilot could never hope to achieve. The sight calculates the wind, the speed, the altitude, and precisely aligns the plane for the perfect drop. The next run is different. The B-17 approaches the target, a small black X painted on the desert floor. The bombardier, a nervous young man named Lieutenant Miller, the same one who had told Red the rumor, is at the controls. He stares into the sight. The bomber, as if by magic, corrects its course. It dips its wing, a subtle adjustment. A moment later, the bombs are released. The pilots watch from the cockpit, their hearts in their throats. They brace themselves for the familiar disappointment. But as the bombs fall, they see them fall in a neat straight line, a perfect string of steel. They hit the target. Not near the target, not around the target, but on the target. A cheer erupts in the cockpit. The promise is real. The Germans, with their blithe confidence, are about to face a truth far more terrifying than they can possibly imagine. A truth that will change the face of the war forever, and a truth that will bring a terrifying new kind of war to their doorstep. But even with this revolutionary tool, the American airmen still faced a brutal reality. The B-17s were flying, essentially, without any real fighter escort, a problem that would become devastatingly clear in the skies over Germany. The Norden bomb site could make them accurate, but it couldn't make them invincible. The first combat missions with the Norden bomb site were a mixed bag. The American military, still refining its doctrine, decided on a strategy of daylight precision bombing. The logic was simple. The Norden needed clear skies to be effective. Bombing at night, as the British RAF was doing, would negate its primary advantage. So, American bombers would fly in broad daylight in massive formations to strike at Germany's most vital industrial centers. But the German High Command had a different plan. They had seen the early, ineffectual raids by American bombers, and they were confident that their formidable fighter forces, the Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, could easily tear apart the slow, unescorted B-17s and B-24s. Red Gallagher's squadron, now flying out of a base in England, was one of the first to be equipped with the Norden. They called themselves the Sons of Norden, a private, almost devotional nickname. The secrecy around the bomb site was still paramount. On the ground, the bomb sites were kept in heavily guarded vaults, and they were only taken out and installed in the bombers just before a mission. The bombardier, the man who would operate the site, was now the most important member of the crew. They were given the nickname Bombardier God and were revered with a mixture of respect and trepidation. On their first mission over occupied France, the target was a submarine pen. The mission was a success. The bombs, to the astonishment of the German anti-aircraft gunners, fell with a horrifying precision. A single B-17, guided by the Norden, placed 3 bombs directly into the mouth of the pen, collapsing the entire structure. The German High Command received the reports with a mixture of disbelief and alarm. They did not carpet bomb, a German general reported to his superior. They hit the target. They hit the target perfectly. It is not possible. They assumed it was a fluke, a lucky shot. But the reports kept coming in. More and more targets, previously untouched by British night raids, were being struck with a terrifying accuracy. Rail yards, factories, oil refineries, all were being hit with a surgical precision that seemed impossible. The Germans started to refer to the American raids as the pinpricks, but the term was no longer a sneer. It was a word of fear. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots, meanwhile, were having a field day. The B-17s and B-24s were, as Göring had predicted, easy targets. The American doctrine of flying in tight combat boxes for mutual defensive fire was a good idea in theory, but in practice, the bombers were still vulnerable. The German pilots, flying the nimble Messerschmitts, would dive through the formations, their cannons and machine guns ripping through the bombers' thin aluminum skin. The American crews, with their heavy armament of 50-caliber machine guns, would fight back, but it was often a losing battle. The Germans developed a new tactic, the head-on pass, where they would fly directly at the bombers, forcing the gunners to aim through the glare of the sun. The losses mounted. Red Gallagher, on a mission over Germany, watched as a B-17 on his wing was hit by a Focke-Wulf. The bomber's wing was sheared off in a gout of flame and smoke. It plunged, spiraling to the earth, a flaming coffin for its 10-man crew. Red felt a cold, sick feeling in his stomach. They had the Norden, yes. They could hit the target. But at what cost? The bomber crews began to question the doctrine. They were fighting a two-front war, one against the enemy on the ground and one against the Luftwaffe in the air. The Norden was a miracle, but it wasn't a shield. The bomber crews in England began to call themselves the Suicide Club. The missions were brutal. A 25-mission tour of duty was considered a miracle. The odds of surviving were less than 1 in 3. The American command, while recognizing the losses, was adamant. The Norden was the key. They believed that if they could destroy Germany's industrial heartland, they could bring the war to an end faster. They believed that the losses were a necessary price to pay. But for the men in the cockpits, the price felt too high. The Germans, meanwhile, were mystified. They couldn't understand how the Americans were achieving such accuracy. They sent up reconnaissance planes to photograph the downed American bombers. They scoured the wreckage for clues. What they found were the broken, mangled remains of the Norden bomb sites. The American crews, in accordance with their training, were trying to destroy them. But the bomb sites were tough. Sometimes a piece would survive the crash. The German intelligence officers, led by a brilliant but cynical man named Major Klaus Richter, began to piece together the puzzle. They found the gyroscopes, the complex lenses, the gears. But they couldn't understand how it worked. It was a machine without a clear purpose, a jumble of seemingly unrelated parts. They consulted their own scientists. "It is a device for calculating trajectories," one of them said. "But it is far too complex. It would require a genius to operate it." The German High Command, in their arrogance, scoffed. They believed that any such device would be too fragile, too complex to be used in combat. They believed that American intelligence was planting false evidence to confuse them. They clung to their belief that the American accuracy was a fluke, a series of lucky shots. They believed their fighters were the only solution. They were convinced that if they could just shoot down enough of the bombers, the Americans would give up on daylight bombing. And they almost did. The losses were becoming unsustainable. The American command, facing a mutiny from its own pilots, was considering a change in strategy. They were thinking of switching to night bombing to conserve their forces. The Norden, the weapon that was supposed to win the war, was proving to be a paradox. It was making them more effective, but it was also making them more vulnerable. But the Germans were still in the dark about the true nature of the Norden. They were convinced it was a clever decoy, a trick. They were convinced that the American bombers were simply flying targets, and they were confident that they would soon be gone. But the American command knew better. They knew that the Norden was their ace in the hole, and they were about to use it to unleash a new kind of terror. They were about to send their bombers deeper into Germany than ever before, to strike at the very heart of the Third Reich. And the Germans would finally learn what the Norden could do, a lesson they would never forget, and one that would cost them dearly. But before that, they would have to face a new reality, a reality that would test their resolve and their courage to the breaking point, a reality that would prove that the Germans were not the only ones with a secret weapon. The stage was set for a new kind of aerial combat, a brutal ballet of steel and fire. And the next act would take place deep inside Germany, far from the reach of the short-range fighter escorts. The American bomber crews were sent on missions deep into the German heartland, far beyond the range of their British-based fighter escorts. The logic from the High Command was that the bombers' own defensive firepower would be enough. This was a brutal miscalculation. The German fighter pilots, operating from bases inside Germany, had a massive advantage. They could intercept the bomber formations with a ferocity and numbers that the Allies hadn't anticipated. Red Gallagher, on a mission to Schweinfurt, a ball-bearing production center vital to the German war machine, felt the true terror of unescorted flight. The B-17s, flying in their tight combat box formations, looked magnificent from below, a silver armada of death. But in the air, they were a fragile, slow-moving target. The German fighters came in waves. They flew in tight packs, the Jagdgeschwader or fighter wings of the Luftwaffe. They used new tactics, Unternehmen tactic, which involved a coordinated attack from multiple directions. The American bomber crews, used to fighting off smaller, less organized attacks, were overwhelmed. Red watched as a German fighter, a Focke-Wulf FW-190, its nose cannons spitting fire, tore into the B-17 next to his. The bomber's fuselage seemed to peel away like a banana skin. The ball turret gunner was hit, the plexiglass shattering, his body flying out into the cold, thin air. The bomber, still flying for a moment, suddenly pitched violently and began a slow, deliberate spin to the earth, leaving a trail of black smoke and debris. It was a terrifying, horrifying sight. The radio crackled with calls for help, with screams of terror, with the last gasps of dying men. The losses were catastrophic. On a single mission to the city of Regensburg, 60 B-17s were shot down. On another to Schweinfurt, 60 more were lost, and over 100 more were so badly damaged they never flew again. This period became known as Black Tuesday, a grim day in the history of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The Germans, watching the American bombers fall from the sky like autumn leaves, were more confident than ever. Goering, at a staff meeting, gloated. "I told you they were nothing but flying coffins. We have broken their will. They will not come again. He was wrong." The American command, shaken but not defeated, was determined to press on. They knew that the Norden, with its surgical precision, was still the key to victory. They needed to find a way to protect the bombers. The solution, they knew, lay in a new kind of fighter, one that could fly deep into Germany and escort the bombers all the way to their targets and back. A fighter with a range far beyond anything the Allies currently possessed. Meanwhile, Major Klaus Richter and his team of German scientists and engineers were working around the clock to decipher the Norden bomb site. They had managed to recover several partially intact sites from downed American bombers. But they were still stumped. The gyroscopes, the complex gearing, the intricate optics. It was a combination of technologies they hadn't seen before. The Americans were far ahead of them in this one narrow field. They ran simulations, they built crude models, but they couldn't make it work. They didn't understand the core principle behind the Norden, its ability to function as an autopilot. The idea of a machine taking control of the plane and flying a perfect, unwavering course was something that was foreign to their engineering philosophy. They were used to building robust, simple machines. The Norden, with its delicate, intricate components, seemed too fragile, too complex for the rigors of combat. They assumed it was a hoax, an elaborate ruse. And so the German High Command continued to scoff at the idea of American precision. They were convinced that the few successful precision strikes were lucky, but the intelligence reports from their agents in the U.S. told a different story. They spoke of the Norden in hushed, reverent tones. They spoke of the oaths of secrecy, the armed guards, the pilots who were ordered to destroy the device if their planes went down. The reports were so fantastical, so unbelievable, that the German High Command dismissed them as American propaganda designed to strike fear into the hearts of the German people. They were so blinded by their own hubris that they couldn't see the truth. But the truth was there, in the skies above Germany, in the smoking wreckage of the B-17s, in the unexploded bombs that had fallen with such brutal, horrifying accuracy. The Americans, they thought, were a force to be laughed at. They believed they had a short shelf life. But they were about to learn a lesson that would change their perception of the war, a lesson that would prove just how wrong they were. The American command, desperate to protect their bombers and their secret weapon, pushed for the development of a long-range fighter. The answer came in the form of a sleek, powerful new aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang, originally designed with a different engine, was a good fighter, but when it was fitted with a new, powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it became a masterpiece. It had a range that was unprecedented for a fighter of its time, able to fly deep into Germany and back, and it was fast, nimble, and heavily armed. The German fighter pilots, used to outmaneuvering the short-range American fighters, were about to face a new and terrifying reality. The Mustangs, with their long-range tanks and powerful engines, could now fly all the way to Berlin and back, and they would be there waiting to protect the bombers. The P-51 was a game-changer. The American High Command knew it. The bomber crews knew it, and the Germans were about to find out. The first mission with the P-51 escorts was a nervous affair. The bomber crews, still traumatized by the losses of Black Tuesday, were skeptical. They had been promised escorts before, only to have them turn back at the last minute. But as they flew deeper into Germany, they saw the Mustangs, their polished aluminum fuselages glinting in the sun, flying on their wings. They were a sight for sore eyes. And the Germans, as they prepared for their usual slaughter, were in for a rude awakening. But the German High Command had another ace up their sleeve, a new type of aircraft, a revolutionary design that they believed would render the American bombers obsolete. They called it the Messerschmitt Me 262. The world's first operational jet fighter. It was a weapon of incredible speed and power, and they believed it would be the ultimate counter to the Allied bomber threat. The war in the air was about to change again, in a way no one could have predicted. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang on the European battlefield was a seismic shift. The German High Command, having celebrated the crippling of the American bomber fleet, was now faced with a new and terrifying problem. Their once impenetrable air defenses were now being systematically dismantled. The P-51s, with their long range, could fly all the way to the most heavily guarded targets deep inside Germany, and they would stay with the bombers, fighting off the Luftwaffe. Red Gallagher, on a mission to Berlin, felt the change immediately. The German fighters still came, but they were no longer unopposed. The P-51s, led by a new generation of aggressive, skillful pilots, met them head-on. The skies over Germany became a chaotic, brutal ballet of dogfights. The P-51s, with their speed and maneuverability, were more than a match for the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The German pilots, who had become complacent and overconfident, were now fighting for their lives. The P-51 pilots had a new, unspoken mission, not just to protect the bombers, but to destroy the Luftwaffe. They would engage the German fighters whenever and wherever they could, driving them from the skies. The German command, receiving the reports of massive losses of their fighter pilots, was in a state of shock. They had not anticipated this. They had underestimated the American capacity for innovation and adaptation. But they had an ace up their sleeve, the Messerschmitt Me-262. It was a marvel of engineering, a jet-powered fighter that could fly at speeds far exceeding the P-51. They believed that with the Me-262, they could once again dominate the skies. Meanwhile, the American bombers, now protected, were using the Norden bomb site to devastating effect. The missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg, once suicide runs, were now proving to be successful. The German industrial machine was being systematically dismantled, factory by factory, rail yard by rail yard. The Norden, with its unyielding precision, was proving to be the ultimate instrument of destruction. A single B-17 on a mission to a German oil refinery could now place a string of bombs directly into the heart of the plant, causing an inferno that would burn for days. The German High Command, now finally accepting the truth of the American accuracy, was in a panic. Major Klaus Richter, the head of German intelligence, finally pieced together the true nature of the Norden. He realized that it was not just a bomb site, but a sophisticated analog computer, a device that could fly the plane with a precision no human could replicate. He reported his findings to the High Command, but his superiors, blinded by their own arrogance, dismissed him. "Richter, you've gone mad," one general sneered. "The Americans are not a nation of engineers. They build simple, crude things. This bomb site is a clever trick. Nothing more." But the evidence was mounting. The American bombers were hitting their targets. The German war machine was slowing down. The German people, once shielded from the war by the myth of the invincible Luftwaffe, were now seeing the reality. Their cities, once safe, were now being bombed with a terrifying, unceasing rhythm. The propaganda machine, which had promised a quick and decisive victory, was now scrambling to explain the mounting destruction. The German High Command, still in denial, poured all their resources into the production of the Me-262, believing it to be the ultimate weapon that would turn the tide of the war. They ignored the fact that their factories were being destroyed, their supply lines were being cut, and their skilled pilots were being systematically shot down. They were fighting a losing battle, and they didn't even know it. The Americans, meanwhile, were on a roll. The combination of the Norden bomb site and the P-51 escort was a 1-2 punch that the Germans had no answer for. But the Germans were not a force to be underestimated. They were still capable of a brilliant, desperate gambit. As the Me-262s began to roll off the production lines, the Germans began to use them in small, highly effective sorties. They would fly so fast that the American fighters couldn't even catch them. The Me-262s would dive through the bomber formations, their cannons tearing the B-17s and B-24s to shreds, and then they would fly away, leaving the American pilots stunned and helpless. Red Gallagher, on a mission to a German synthetic oil plant, watched in horror as a Me-262, a blur of motion and fire, flashed through his formation. The bomber on his left, a B-17 with the nickname the Iron Maiden, was hit. Its wing was torn off and the plane spiraled to the earth. The P-51 escorts, who had been so effective against the German propeller fighters, were helpless. They simply couldn't catch the jets. The German command, seeing the success of the Me-262s, was jubilant. They believed they had found the solution. But they had one fatal flaw in their thinking. They were still underestimating the American capacity for innovation. The Americans would find a way to counter the jet threat. They would adapt. They always did. The war was far from over, and the next chapter would be a bloody, brutal struggle for technological supremacy, a struggle that would determine the fate of the war and the future of air power forever. But even with the new jet fighters, the Germans had another, even more formidable threat to contend with. The American bombers using the Norden bomb site were about to strike at the very heart of the Third Reich's power. They were about to strike at the one place the German High Command thought was untouchable, and they would do it with a precision that would shock the world. The German High Command, confident in their new Me-262 jet fighters, believed they had once again found a way to blunt the American bomber offensive. The jets were a game-changer, their speed and firepower a terrifying new reality for the Allied airmen. Red Gallagher and his squadron, flying on a mission to a German tank factory, were now faced with a new kind of terror. The Me-262s, with their jet engines screaming, would flash past the bombers, their cannons spitting fire. They were in and out before the P-51s could even react. The American command, recognizing the new threat, began to devise a new strategy. They realized they couldn't outrun the jets, so they had to outsmart them. The American P-51 pilots began to develop new tactics. They would fly in staggered formations, with some P-51s at high altitude and others at low altitude, hoping to catch the Me-262s on their takeoff and landing runs. They also realized that the jets, while fast, were not as maneuverable as the propeller fighters. The P-51 pilots would try to force the jets into a turning fight, where the P-51 had the advantage. The German fighter pilots, meanwhile, were struggling. The Me-262s were fragile and prone to mechanical failures. They were also being produced in limited numbers. The German High Command, blinded by their obsession with the wonder weapon, made a fatal mistake. Instead of using the Me-262 as a purely defensive fighter, they tried to use it as a bomber, a role it was not suited for. The result was a tragic waste of a powerful weapon. Meanwhile, the American bombers, now with a new lease on life, thanks to the P-51 escorts and the Norden bomb site, were wreaking havoc on the German war machine. The German High Command, now finally convinced of the Norden's capabilities, was in a state of panic. They sent Major Richter to meet with the Führer himself. Richter, a brilliant man, laid out the evidence. He showed the Führer the recovered Norden parts, the reports from their spies, the undeniable accuracy of the American bombs. "Mein Führer," Richter pleaded, "this is not a trick. It is a genuine weapon of surgical precision. They are not bombing our cities. They are systematically dismantling our industrial capacity. We must find a way to counter this device, or we will lose the war." Hitler, however, was in a state of denial. He refused to believe that the Americans, whom he saw as a race of crass, uncultured opportunists, could build such a device. He believed that the American raids were still just lucky shots, and that the Me-262 was the ultimate weapon that would turn the tide. He ordered Richter to be sent to the Eastern Front, a punishment for his defeatist attitude. The German High Command, in its arrogance, refused to accept the truth. And so, the American bombers, with their Norden bomb sites and their P-51 escorts, continued their work. The targets were no longer just factories and rail yards. The Americans were now striking at the very heart of the German government. A new mission was planned. The target: Hitler's bunker in Berlin. A mission of such audacity, of such symbolic importance, that it was kept a secret from even the highest ranks of the military. Red Gallagher and his squadron were chosen for the mission. They were told the target was a strategic communications center, a flimsy cover for the truth. The day of the mission was a tense, quiet affair. The bomber crews were briefed on the new tactics for dealing with the Ma-262s. They were told to stay in tight formations, to use their defensive firepower, and to rely on the P-51s to protect them. The weather was clear, a perfect day for a bombing run. As they flew over Germany, they saw the devastation below them. Entire cities had been leveled. The German High Command, in its folly, had allowed the American bombers to fly unmolested for too long. They had squandered their resources and their time on a fantasy of a wonder weapon, and now they were paying the price. As they approached Berlin, the Me-262s came out to meet them. But this time, the P-51s were ready. They engaged the jets, forcing them into dogfights, wearing them down. Some of the jets were shot down. Others were damaged and forced to retreat. The skies over Berlin were a chaotic, brutal battlefield. The American bombers with their P-51 escorts pushed on. The target, Hitler's bunker, was a small, reinforced concrete structure almost impossible to hit with conventional bombing. But the Norden was not a conventional bomb site. The bombardier, a young man from Texas named Lieutenant Billy Tex Henderson, was at the controls of the Norden. He stared into the sight, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw the target, a small speck on the ground, growing larger. The bomber, guided by the Norden, flew a perfectly straight, unwavering course. The German anti-aircraft guns opened up, but their fire was inaccurate. They couldn't hit the bomber, which seemed to be flying on an invisible rail. Tex pressed the button. The bombs, a string of 10 500-pounders, were released. He watched as they fell, a perfect line of steel, straight for the target. They hit the bunker. The explosion was immense. The American bombers, their mission complete, turned and flew home, leaving behind a smoking ruin. The German High Command, receiving the reports of the bombing, was in a state of shock. They couldn't believe it. The bunker, a symbol of Hitler's power, had been hit. It was an impossible shot. A fluke, they said, but they knew, deep down, it wasn't. They knew that the Americans had a weapon that they couldn't counter. A weapon of such precision, of such devastating power, that it would change the course of the war. They had scoffed at the B-17s. They had underestimated the Norden. And now, they were paying the ultimate price. The war, they knew, was now a matter of time, and the clock was ticking. They were about to learn a new, horrifying truth. That the Americans were not just content with bombing their industrial centers and their military installations. They were about to take the war to a whole new level, a level of total destruction, a level of absolute terror. And the Norden, the instrument of precision, would be the instrument of that destruction. The successful bombing of Hitler's bunker was a symbolic victory of immense proportions. But it was just a taste of what was to come. The American High Command, seeing the effectiveness of the Norden bomb site, began to use it for missions that were once considered impossible. They began to bomb military targets with a precision that was unheard of, a precision that would change the very nature of warfare. Red Gallagher and his squadron, now seasoned veterans, were flying a new kind of mission. They were bombing German V-2 rocket production sites. These sites, located deep underground and heavily fortified, were considered untouchable. The V-2 rockets, the world's first ballistic missiles, were a terrifying new weapon, a symbol of German ingenuity and desperation. But the Norden changed the game. The B-17s, guided by the bomb sight, would fly low and fast, dropping bombs with a surgical precision that could collapse the entrances to the underground bunkers. The German High Command, watching their wonder weapons being systematically destroyed, was in a state of disbelief. They had a powerful weapon, but they were unable to use it effectively because the American bombers, with their Norden bomb sight, were destroying the very infrastructure needed to produce them. The German industrial machine was on its knees. The rail yards were in ruins. The oil refineries were destroyed. The factories were a smoking pile of rubble. The German people, once confident in their military superiority, were now living in a state of perpetual fear. The American bombers, with their silver fuselages glinting in the sun, were a constant presence in the skies, a constant reminder of their defeat. The war in Europe was drawing to a close. The Allied armies were advancing on all fronts. The German army was in full retreat. But the final act of the war, the most devastating of all, was still to come. The Americans, with their military-industrial complex in full swing, had developed a new kind of weapon. A weapon so powerful, so destructive, that it would change the course of history forever. A weapon that would be dropped from the skies. A weapon that would be guided by the same technology that had guided the B-17s. The atomic bomb, a product of the Manhattan Project, was a scientific marvel, but it was also a weapon of mass destruction. The scientists who had built it, men like J. Robert Oppenheimer, were filled with a sense of both triumph and trepidation. They knew they had created a monster, but the military, with its cold, hard logic, saw it as a solution, a way to end the war quickly and decisively, a way to save American lives. The atomic bomb, however, was not a precision weapon in the same sense as the bombs dropped from the B-17s. Its destructive radius was so vast that it didn't need the pinpoint accuracy of the Norden. But the bomb was still a product of the same technological revolution that had produced the Norden, the same spirit of American ingenuity, the same belief in the power of technology to solve problems. The Norden bomb site, with its promise of a more humane, more precise kind of warfare, had ironically led to the development of a weapon of total, indiscriminate destruction. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. The German High Command, in their final days, was a broken, defeated group of men. They had scoffed at the American bombers. They had laughed at the idea of precision bombing. They had underestimated the power of the Norden bomb site. And now their country was in ruins. The war in the Pacific, however, continued, and the world was about to see the full, terrible potential of the new American weapon. The Norden bomb site, once a symbol of precision, was now a stepping stone to a new kind of terror. The final chapter of the war was about to be written, and it would be written in a flash of light, a roar of thunder, and a mushroom cloud of death. The Norden bomb site, the weapon of precision, had changed everything, but it had also led to something far more terrifying. Something that would haunt the world for generations to come. The story of the Norden bomb site is a story of ingenuity and arrogance, of technological triumph and moral compromise. It is a story that proves that even the most well-intentioned inventions can have unforeseen and terrifying consequences. The world was about to learn a lesson it would never forget. And the American airmen, the men who had flown with the Blue Ox, would be the ones to deliver it. And so, the story of the Norden bomb site ends not with a bang, but with a horrifying, silent flash. The world changed forever, and it was all because a machine, once dismissed, changed the face of warfare forever. The final chapter of the war, and the first chapter of a new, more terrifying era, was about to begin. And the bomber, a lonely B-29, was on its way.